What is up, Flick fans, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking television. That's right, not movies, not just Netflix like we normally do. We're talking all things TV, and I'm giving you guys my personal favorite top 10 TV shows of all time. Now, I want you to keep in mind before we get started that I haven't seen every show that's ever existed. There are multiple shows that maybe I started watching and I love, but I just got so busy and life gets in the way and you just haven't found the time to finish. So there are absolutely going to be shows that are not on this list, and if they're considered classics and they are clearly the best shows of all time and you don't hear me talk about them today, it probably means I haven't seen them. Shows such as The Sopranos, I've watched a lot of it and I love it, but I haven't seen every episode. The Wire, I've never even seen The Wire, and trust me guys, I know, it's one that I 1000% need to go back to, but there's so much new stuff and so many things that I review on this channel, and even a show like MASH, right? Before my time, obviously, but it is something at some point in my life I do want to go back to because I hear nothing but great things about those shows, West Wing, etc. I haven't seen them, so if you don't hear me talk about them, that's probably why. There are also going to be people wondering, Austin, where is the anime, man? Where is One Punch Man, Attack on Titan? And a lot of these shows I'm still in the process of watching and digesting, and I want to build up a resume for a separate list for all shows anime. So even though something like a One Punch Man Season 1 is easily one of my favorite seasons of all time, I'm going to be doing a separate list for that. Today we're focusing on Western television. I'm going to be including some animation, some shows that I grew up with that other people watching this are going to go, huh? But this is a list of my favorites. This isn't the list of the most high-quality shows of all time. If that was the case, this list would be extremely different, and I feel like I would have had to do more preparation. But here we go, guys. My personal favorite shows of all time. And oh my god, do we have some honorable mentions. Let's get into those real quick. And my honorable mentions are Family Guy, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Friends, Seinfeld, Season 1 of Haunting of Hill House, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is incredible, American Vandal, Drake and Josh, Batman, the animated series. Oh, the fact that that's not on this list. Star Trek, The Next Generation, Flash, The Handmaid's Tale. Yeah, Lost didn't make it, even though it got close. And two animated shows that I love, Regular Show and Adventure Time. Clearly, favorites. Now, there is another show that I've not gotten clarification on if it's a limited series or a season of television, right? And that show is 11/22/63, which was pushing my number 10 spot because I just think that show is massively underrated, incredible, but limited series, and that's where your Band of Brothers and your Chernobyls come in, and it's another list for another time. So alright guys, those are my honorable mentions. Let's get into the top 10. And coming in at number 10 is a show that I believe if it would have gotten a few more seasons and kind of paid off on the storylines that it set up, it probably would have been higher, but it still comes in at number 10, and that show is Daredevil on Netflix. And my goodness, guys, when this show got canceled, I was incredibly just baffled. I was baffled, and I really do. I think Daredevil is one of those superhero shows that transcended television, brought in a new audience to just realize what you can do with a down-to-earth superhero, yes, but what you can do with comic book characters on the small screen. And yes, you have a show like The Flash or an Arrow on the CW, but that does bring, and I admit these shows are more of a guilty pleasure, but it brings in the schmaltzy, over-dramatic feel. You don't get that with a show like Daredevil. Daredevil is gritty, it's realistic, it is so down-to-earth, and I loved everything about it. And now here's my chance to talk about a show like The Punisher that gave us one incredible season, and one season that I still enjoyed probably more than others, but to put it in my honorable mentions or in my top 10, I think is pushing it just because there wasn't enough of The Punisher to decide whether or not I loved it on that level, right? And that's the sad thing about this Marvel Netflix universe going away now. There's still, I'm holding out hope it comes back, but Charlie Cox as this character is just monumentally fantastic. Vincent D'Onofrio, still one of my favorite Marvel villains of all time as the Kingpin. Their clash the relationships between the characters, and just every season bringing us something a bit different. Now, season 2 probably being my least favorite, but I still really enjoyed the first half, especially of season 2. And all 3 seasons, they combine to make something that's a monumental experience. And the fact that it's this low on my list, in terms of quality, it would probably be in the top 5, but just in terms of how much I love these other shows above it and how much they resonate towards me, I'm putting it at number 10. And at number 9, we are staying in the Netflix lane, and I can't tell you how much I love Stranger Things. And I know it's gonna be a bit of pushback. It's like, he just likes it because of the nostalgia, because he feels nostalgic for, wait a second, he didn't grow up in the 80s. And it's true, I didn't grow up in the 80s, so I shouldn't be the one having nostalgia for this show, but it's one of those shows, and I said it in my review, I feel like when I'm watching it, I feel like it's a show that I grew up with, but I'm not watching it until I'm in my late teens and now early 20s, right? I love Stranger Things. I love what it brings to the table. Now, some people didn't love seasons 2 and 3 as much as they loved season 1. I personally really enjoyed season 3, but this entire show is just combining things that people love. It's humor with a great cast, an awesome coming-of-age story that we're not done with just yet. No way they're canceling Stranger Things. We're going to keep coming back to these characters as they're getting older, as they're progressing, and it just feels like one giant 80s movie combining things that we love, combining sci-fi and the action/adventure elements that we love from movies, especially movies from that time period. And Stranger Things, it's just something that it sticks with me. I'm always thinking about it, how much I love that particular Netflix show. It's not my favorite Netflix show. We'll talk about that here in a bit, but I love it so much, and it's one that I just can't wait to see what happens next. Now, the fact that I'm putting shows on here that aren't done yet right, or the fact that you're comparing, a show with 2 seasons to something like what I'm about to talk about, a show with like 20 seasons, it feels weird comparing all of these different things to each other, but maybe my favorite season of television, I'll do a different video on that. But in terms of my favorite shows, I have to look at the shows as a whole, how excited I am for some of them to continue, and just how happy they left me when I was done with them, right? Stranger Things comes in at number 9, and I truly love it. That's right, I'm throwing you guys a curveball. I'm an early 2000s kid. Wasn't born in the early 2000s, but that was really when I have most of my memories from that time, and a show that just dominated when I was younger. Now, I will admit, I go back and I watch, not the old episodes, but I watch the show now because it's still on, the show being SpongeBob SquarePants, and I'm like, well, the new one's, sure. But I look at like that 6-season span of the first 6 seasons of SpongeBob when I was watching the show. And it's not a show that has a consistent storyline like a Sopranos, right? So when I say, well, I haven't watched every episode of SpongeBob, it's not one of those shows, right? If you've seen SpongeBob, you know what SpongeBob is. Heck, if you've seen a season, one of the good seasons, then you know the quality level of what this show used to be. Now, I have heard from a few people that it's getting back on track and people are starting to like it again, but those first 6 seasons, man, and even a few episodes from the later seasons, I love this show so much. I think SpongeBob SquarePants is one of the greatest animated characters and animated shows, and you go back to the earlier seasons, and it's not just a show for kids, man. They were throwing in the adult references left and right, adult references that I didn't notice until I went back recently and started watching the show again just because I love it so much. Being able to quote every single line of dialogue, which I was doing, right? My wife's sitting there rolling her eyes like, what is wrong with you? But even she was laughing. She's like, this is really funny. Adults can get just as much out of it as kids do. Now, if it's your first time going and watching SpongeBob, then I don't know. It's absolutely a nostalgia thing, but once again, it's my favorite shows. And SpongeBob, man, as much as I talk about it and reference it and the memes and just everything, the fact that it's still part of a conversation, the old episodes are still part of the conversation all the time, it's pretty impressive. And I love this show so much. And then we come to number 7, and let me tell you, this hurts my soul. This hurts my ever-living soul putting this show this low, but I have to do it, and that's Parks and Recreation. I go back and I watch Parks and Recreation, and another show that I'll talk about here in a bit, more than I do any other show. I mean, I could watch every season consistently over and over and not feel bad about it at all. Now, the final season of Parks and Rec, I don't think measures up to when the show was just knocking it out of the park. And I mean hitting as hard as you possibly can. But I love every character in this show. Andy, Leslie Knope, Ron Swanson, iconic character. I mean, Rob Lowe is better here than maybe he's ever been in his entire life. Chris Traeger is just such a quotable character, and that's the thing about this show. Once you get past, the first few episodes where you're like, this could be, just a ripoff of The Office, and I don't want that to be the case, and I had that stigma going in. I'm like, all right, so many people have recommended this show, and then you get past that, and you're just like, this turned into something else entirely. They quit relying on what people loved about The Office. They built their own world. Now, in terms of world building and lore, I do think it works better than The Office in that regard. I mean, they have just this entire Pawnee world that you live in and reoccurring characters, and everything about Parks and Rec works so well. I love the show. I love the characters. I watch it, this and the other thing, more than any other comedy I've ever watched or probably ever will watch, and it's fantastic. Next up, it's Game of Thrones. Now, Game of Thrones is a very divisive show in terms of what people think about the final season, and the final season left a lot of people on a really, really sour note, and it's still a show that I look at and I say, this is probably the highest quality show. If we're doing best TV shows of all time, quality-wise, Game of Thrones is an easy number one for me. There's no denying it. Even the final season, even though I didn't love the storyline and everything that happened and the way that it ended up, I'm just like, that's disappointing. HBO tends to do that, right? But quality-wise, acting, directing, what I look at when I critique a movie or a TV show, it's number one. It's easy for me. It's number one. But in terms of my favorite, I didn't get on the Game of Thrones train, right, until a few years after it started. Then I caught up, and I just consistently watched. I didn't do anything on YouTube just because I felt like I wanted to be more of a fan than more of a critic of the show. And as soon as I start doing weekly reviews is when the show starts getting really divisive, and people just don't like it as much. Now, I know that the vocal minority, they're a lot louder on Twitter than the people that loved this final season, but I'm kind of with you in terms of some of the critiques that I have. And because of that, I do think it takes this down a few spots in terms of favorite, right? Not in terms of quality. But it's still Game of Thrones. It's still this fantasy epic that I will never, ever see anything like again on television. Maybe the Amazon Prime Lord of the Rings show comes close, right? And maybe we start getting quality content on this level from every single channel and every single streaming service, but I just don't see it happening, right? Game of Thrones is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. It's a once-in-a-generation thing. It changed television. It started the TV renaissance, and I do believe it changed it for the better. I love everything about this show, barring a few things, a few decisions in the final season, maybe some storylines that didn't pay off, and it's all about the payoff, right? But still, it's Game of Thrones, guys. I love the majority of it. Love the majority of the characters, and it turned Peter Dinklage into one of my favorite actors of all time, and that's why it's at this spot on this list. Next up, here is my Game of Thrones when I was growing up. Here is my animated version of the epic, the grand scale that everyone else feels when they watch Game of Thrones. For me, that was Avatar: The Last Airbender. I think this show is just the best. It's the best when you look at original fantasy television with characters and lore and situations and voice acting and comedy and everything you want in a TV show or a movie. Everything you need in a story. Characters that you just fall in love for. You fall in love with them. Now, Legend of Korra, the spin-off show, I watched about half of it, and I didn't fall off. I really enjoyed it. It's just like you get busy in life, and sometimes you can't finish things. I need to finish that. But Avatar: The Last Airbender is just a monumental show. It's a monumental show. I found a Blu-ray the other day at Walmart, and it was every episode of The Last Airbender and every episode of The Legend of Korra. It was expensive. And I'm like, I could just buy that on a whim because it's so good. If you haven't seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, you're missing out on probably one of the most high-quality animation, Western animated shows you'll ever see. It had anime feels to it. It had a monumental cast. When you look at voice actors who voice multiple things in multiple different TV shows, you're like, oh, I recognize that guy and this guy and that girl and all the voice. It's just so good, guys. And the concept of controlling the elements and building this one kid up who starts out and he questions the reason why am I this chosen one, right? Why do I have to master water, air, earth, fire? Why is it me? And then, there's a romantic element, and then there are new characters that come in. They start out as villains, they turn into heroes. They start out as heroes, they turn into villains. It's everything you want in a fantasy epic. I mean, Avatar: The Last Airbender was my favorite non-comedic animated show growing up, and I go back and I watch it today and I'm like, yeah, this is just super high quality. It's something that should have made a great movie. It didn't. But Netflix is doing their version of it. I'm not opposed because, I could always use more Avatar, but I'm interested to see what direction it goes down. I love this show, and that's why it's at this spot. But a show that goes down a different route from Avatar: The Last Airbender, and even though it's funny like a Spongebob, it's a different kind of funny. We've not put an adult animation on this list yet, right? Austin, where's Family Guy? Well, that was in the honorable mentions. I love Family Guy. Massive fan of that show. But in terms of quality, that show will come up and then it'll peak down a little bit, and then you got a great episode, and then an episode you're like, all right. I don't feel that way about anything when it comes to Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty is just consistently one of the funniest shows, and the fact that there's only been this amount of seasons, only been 3 seasons, and I'm so hooked on the story. And with these comedy animated shows like a SpongeBob, there's not a consistent storyline, right? There are consistent side plots that come back into play, but you're not really following these characters on a journey. With Rick and Morty, they're in the midst of their journey right now. You have the evil Morty storyline. You have Rick and Morty's dynamic that's constantly shifting. You have Jerry and Beth, their kind of fallout with their marriage. A lot of things happening, a lot of deeper themes when it comes to this show and shows in general, right? Rick and Morty hits on those things, and it's not afraid to tell the audience exactly what they're thinking, exactly what they're feeling. It's dumb, it's silly, but it's also really smart, and it juggles so many elements that I don't think other shows are just wanting to tackle in 2019. And that's important, and that's why Rick and Morty, I think, transcends what it means to be an adult, funny animated show. No, it's more than that, especially to me, and recently got my wife on board. Yes. All right, let's not beat around the bush here. Mindhunter is just phenomenal. I love Mindhunter so much. I think it's a Netflix show that transcended Netflix at the time, and now Netflix is consistently, well, that's not the word, bringing us really good content, and sometimes not the best content, but Mindhunter was really one of the first to break ground in terms of what a streaming show could be, because one, you have David Fincher coming in here, one of my favorite directors working right now, and he just brings his flair, his edge. But the entire idea, the concept of exploring what it means to be a criminal, what it means to consider doing this, that, and the other thing that maybe, it's a bit difficult to talk about, and this show is difficult to watch at times because you're exploring the mind of a serial killer, and that's not something that's for the faint of heart. But it's not a show that brings you consistent action. It's not upbeat. It's not crazy when it comes to pacing. But I'm so invested, and I'm so entertained, and these main characters and Bill and Holden and just the storylines are bafflingly delicious from a screenwriting perspective. It's just all around. It's one of the highest quality shows I've ever seen, but I'm also putting it top 3 in my favorites because I just love watching it. I love every single episode. I was locked in to this season, completely locked in, loved everything about it. I've seen it twice. And a lot of that is because my wife didn't watch it with me the first time. I'm like, yeah, let's do it. We did it. It was great. Just as great the second time. I actually think I got a bit more out of it, and I cannot wait for season 3, guys. Mindhunter is phenomenal. And I may love it more than some, but I love it. And coming in at number 2 is The Office. You guys knew it was coming, and this is my favorite comedic series of all time. And Austin, why is it your favorite? And why haven't you done The Office tier list yet? Well, I'm still in the midst of, it's probably the hardest thing I've ever done, because when trying to pick between all of these characters that you love and you feel like you just know them. Even when a John Krasinski or a Rainn Wilson pops up in another movie, I'm like, oh, it's Dwight and it's Jim. I can't separate them now because I love everything about this show. I love it. And it starts out on a bit of a slow foot, but then you start to understand the humor and you start to understand the character of Michael Scott, who is one of the greatest characters ever created for television, and Steve Carell is probably giving the best performance you'll ever see in a comedy show. I mean, he's just phenomenal, and the way the show progresses, and the progression of the characters, and the storylines that you get invested in, I mean, in my opinion, it's personal, it's all about my favorites, once again, in my opinion, there's no comparison to any other show in history when you talk about how natural this humor is. I mean, it's so natural. And no offense to shows which are on my honorable mentions that have studio audiences. No offense at all. But when you have characters, pausing for audience laughter and the multicam setup, I mean, not to say that that's outdated, because it's not. It can work nowadays, right? And it does work. But I prefer something like this. I prefer something that feels more realistic, and when the characters are talking to you, you feel that sense of, oh, all right, they're talking to me. And it's not just pointless, needless exposition. It is something that adds to the story and the way that the story is told. And I think it's hilarious. Now, inevitably, there are going to be comments, I don't think The Office is funny. I've seen it before. And that's fine. It's all subjective. It all comes down to what shows speak to you. And that's the beauty of television. It's the beauty of movies. Movies are a bit different, right? Television, you have more time to invest in the characters. There's more of a build-up. There's more of a letdown if it doesn't deliver, right? It's an interesting debate. It's an interesting comparison, comparing the two things. But in terms of television, in terms of comedy shows that will have a lasting impression, and the fact that this is Netflix #1 show still, and they're giving away, which is not good. But The Office is just utterly rewatchable. I think I've watched it 6 times, 7 times now. It's more than I've ever seen a TV show, and that's why it's #2. Almost #1, but not #1. Because #1, for me, is Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad is the greatest television show of all time. I said Game of Thrones could be #1 when it comes to quality. If there was ever a comparison to be made, I would compare Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad. Which one is higher quality? You got the special effects and the technical achievement and just mastering fantasy for Game of Thrones, but then you have the real life tragedy, not real life, but what feels like real life tragedy. And I'd say the screenwriting, I'd give an edge to Breaking Bad. I'd say the performances, looking at Heisenberg as a character, I think he's the greatest character of all time. Walter White is just phenomenal, and it's one that I constantly go back to, and I'll just watch a random episode of. And I don't do that with epic, intense, non-comedic series. I usually don't watch more than once, even if I love them. Like a Breaking Bad, I'm just like, watched it once, I've had enough, it's phenomenal, but I'm just going to watch these other things because I have things to review. Not Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad, I'll just throw on an episode sometimes because I love these characters, I love these stories. I don't love every performance in this show. There are a few I'm like, they're fine. But 98% of Breaking Bad, to me, is perfect. You couldn't, and it's not a show, that has a lackluster season, or it's not a show that has a non-monumental ending. It has everything. Has a great ending, has a great beginning, everything. Everything about this show works. It's phenomenal. Maybe 3 out of the top 5 most iconic television scenes in history. And comparing that to every other show, I mean, what else is there to say about Breaking Bad other than I just think it's the best. I think it's the best of the best. It's definitely my favorite, barely above The Office, but it's also the best. And I love everything about it. Maybe I'm being biased because, we got this movie coming out, and no. And here's what I think I'm going to do in preparation for the film. I think I'm going to go back and I think I'm going to rank the seasons of Breaking Bad, which is going to be a hard thing to do because they're all just fantastic. But that's what I'm going to do because there's a lot of build-up and anticipation for this movie. Fun fact, Better Call Saul. Really love what I'm seeing so far, but I'm about halfway through what's already out, which is why I didn't talk about it in my honorable mentions, but really, I love it, and it'll definitely end up there once I catch up. Thank you guys so much for watching this video of my favorite, not the best, TV shows of all time. I need your lists. I want to see shows you recommend. Austin, why the heck didn't you talk about this show? Let me know, man. I love a good recommendation. I love what you guys are consistently doing in the comment section, and I appreciate you for everything that you do, for all of your support, for watching this entire video, listening to my spiel, and you guys are truly 1000% the absolute best, everything that you do, and I appreciate it. I'll see you very soon.